The time is 6:31 p.m. I will now call the April 15th, 2024 special meeting of the Common Council of the City of Lawrence to order. Will you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let us bow our heads in prayer now. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Amen. Amen. We'll now have the roll call. Let the records reflect that there are 9 councilors present. And say their names. Okay. Okay. Councilors, say your names.
Giles.
Oh, Councilor Wells.
Counselor Chavis.
Counselor Kramer.
Councilor Robinson.
Counselor Jennings.
Counselor Freeman.
Counselor Crone. Counselor Mazur.
Thank you, councilors. This meeting has been properly noticed in accordance with the Indiana Open Door Law. Copies of the agenda are located in the back of the meeting room. Also, for any citizens wishing to speak under citizens' comments later in the agenda, please sign in using the sign-in sheet located in the back of the meeting room. The next agenda item is ratification of contracts. I understand that Deputy Chief of Staff Lovell will be presenting these contracts this evening. Mr. Lovell.
Thank you, councilors. Just as I mentioned in the email that I sent to all of you last week, there are 4 contracts that will go before you for consideration. All of those we expect to exceed the $50,000 threshold for professional service contracts, 3 of which will be paid through proceeds of the bond request that will be presented before you all today. Part of that, and I mentioned earlier on your request, on your claims today, that Bondry will be paid $20,000. That's mainly their work through the cumulative cap presentation they gave about 3 weeks ago, and the rest will be paid through the proceeds of the bond. On top of that, Sandy Solutions, which is our IT services, it was a month-to-month, but now we went to an agreement for a year contract, and that has already been budgeted for this year. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lovell. On behalf of the Common Council, I'm referring these contracts to the Administration and Finance Committee for consideration and recommendation. The next agenda item is comments of Common Council members and special recognitions or resolutions. Do any council members have comments? Do you have any special recognitions or resolutions this evening? Anyone? Okay. The next agenda item is approval of minutes. We have no minutes. We have no minutes this evening for approval. The next agenda item will be reports of committees. We have any reports from committees? We have no reports this evening. The next agenda item is unfinished business. We have none. Under new business, presentation on financial matters. Under new business is presented on financial matters. I ask that the presenter this evening please approach the podium and state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, council members. My name's Dennis Otten. I'm with the law firm of Bose, McKinney & Evans. We're at 111 Monument Circle, Suite 2700 in Indianapolis, Indiana. This evening, it's my pleasure to talk to you a little bit. I'm going to call it kind of a municipal bonds 101, but I understand there's been a request to sort of have a high-level presentation on municipal bonding and what that means for the city of Lawrence. And so I put on each of your desks the materials I have tonight, and I've also got my contact information as well as my partner Jacob McClellan, who I believe was at your last council meeting. So I want to preface my remarks by saying any questions you might have, feel free to interrupt me, or if I say anything that you don't understand, please interrupt me and let me know. I want this to be an open discussion, and I also want it to be the case of if after this presentation you go home and you're sitting around and maybe you have a question that you want to ask, feel free to contact myself or Jacob, send an email. We want to be a resource for you and help you. We know financing is a complex matter. There's a lot involved with it. So with that, I'm going to start quickly with the package here. When we talk about municipal finance, what we're talking about at a high level is city borrowing money. And cities, unlike companies, don't go down to banks or individuals. If you buy a house, you go get a mortgage, you talk to your bank. If a city wants to borrow money, they do it by issuing bonds, or what we call bond anticipation notes. It's the same thing, but it's driven by statute. There needs to be statutory authority to issue debt, and the way that is issued is through a bond. And the statutes tell us the procedures that we need to go through to issue those bonds. So the bond's a debt instrument that the lender receives, kind of like a promissory note when you enter into a mortgage. They get the bond, and that's the contract. And also with that is sort of the trust indenture or the bond ordinance. When we talk about Lawrence, there's broad authority to issue debt. We're talking about road projects, utilities, parks, municipal buildings. That includes public safety, police stations, fire stations, community centers, and also, importantly, economic development and redevelopment projects. We have a couple slides here where we're going to talk more about redevelopment, working with developers to try to couple powers and authority you have as a city to enhance and promote economic development within the city to help projects happen that may otherwise not happen, or if they did happen, they wouldn't be as good as they could be without the incentives that you all have as a council. I mentioned here constitutional debt limit. You may hear from time to time when you're hearing about bond issues, someone says, well, is that within your debt limit? The debt limit for a city is 2% of, that's the constitutional debt limit. They say it's 2% of your assessed valuation. There's actually a formula for it. We take the net assessed value, divide it by 3, and we take 2% of that. There's a long story behind that, but for City of Lawrence, your debt limit is $14,632,000 and some change. Now, what I want to say about that is it doesn't mean that that's all the debt you can issue. It's just a direct debt, a general obligation bond. You can only issue up to that amount. If we go above that, we'll talk a little bit about this. We'll do what's called a lease financing structure. And I'll tell you, 90% of school buildings in Indiana, bonds are not actually issued by the school corporation. They're issued by a building corporation that then leases the school. The school corporation and the courts have said a lease doesn't count as debt. And so whenever we encounter a debt issue limitation, we flip over to a lease financing structure. We end up at the same place. You're still paying for the obligation. You're just doing it through a lease financing mechanism. And at the end, you'll own that facility. So police stations, fire stations, city halls, those are the common types of things we see lease financings for. And what triggers something that counts against a debt limit? It's if we have a pledge of property taxes or other local income tax revenues. You're going to be presented with a bond ordinance that is going to be a general obligation bond ordinance. That counts. So part of our job as that is to say, hey, does this fit within the debt limit? You have some debt that's outstanding that's payable from transportation tax levied funds. Those count as well. Now, you only have, I think, $345,000 or so left on that, so it's good. You have a large margin of GO bond capacity, we call it. And that's a good thing because you have flexibility when you're issuing general obligation bonds. You can issue them rather quickly if you need to. So I always say it's good to keep your powder dry, have that ability in the tank if you need it. That's not to say you can use it all up if you want to, but I just mentioned that. Another thing you might hear about when we talk about bond issues with the property tax pledge, you may have heard this term, a controlled project. What does that mean? And referendums, petition remonstrance, what does that mean? If you go out and issue bonds that are payable from a property tax levy, and you expect to levy that property tax, Indiana law has put some procedures in place that says, hey, if you go beyond a certain threshold amount on that cost of that project, then you've got to hold a couple of extra hearings. You have to advertise a notice that will give people the opportunity to start what's called a petition or a remonstrance process, or put it on the ballot. It's high threshold for Lawrence. That's 500 people need to sign this petition. But if they do sign it, the project is one that's between $6.3 million and $19 million. Throws you into what we call a petition remonstrance process. If the project's over $19 million, you can throw it into a referendum. You won't be able to issue the bonds until that goes on the ballot, it gets voted for, and it may be approved or not approved. You've probably heard over the last few years, a lot of school corporations have projects that go on the ballot. IPS and others, and they have to get voter approval. But if they don't get the voter approval, then the project's dead for about a year. And the reason is that's a controlled project. Now, projects that are less than $6.3 million, you're not subject to these rules. Adopt your bond ordinance, and do, there's a few notices we do, but it's not an opportunity to remonstrate. So that's another thing we're always looking at when you're doing bonds. And an interesting thing, it's not the total amount of bonds. You could do a $12 million bond issue. So you could fund two separate projects, two separate distinct projects with that one bond issue. And it's measured on the actual project, not the bond size. So sometimes we'll fund several projects with one bond issue that would exceed the amount, but the individual projects don't. Talk about for funds here and what do we pledge to bond issues. Most commonly you think of a general obligation bond, a property tax levy. That is an additional levy that the property taxpayers within the city of Lawrence have to pay to fund the obligation. Now there's other sources of funds. We have a slide on this, utility revenues, very common, water, sewer, local income tax revenues. The city gets an allocation of local income tax revenues that can be pledged as a source of funds. Talk about tax increment finance revenues here in a second. TIF is the common term used for that. That can be a source. Motor vehicle highway taxes, food and beverage tax. So part of the job of the finance team when you're looking at a project is what's the project cost? What capacities do you have, and what revenue streams do we want to put together to help pay for this? And a lot of times that'll be dictated by the project itself. I've got here a slide. I'm not going to touch it too much, but the city can act as a conduit issuer. Sometimes you may have a nonprofit, say for example a YMCA that wants to finance a project. They're going to fund all of it, but the city can provide its lien to those bonds to help the YMCA, as an example, get tax exemption on those bonds. We call that a pure conduit issue. I can't remember if Lawrence has had any of those recently, but you might be approached from time to time with sometimes there are these multifamily housing projects, low-income housing projects that will come in that are getting a tax credit, and they'll go, we want to issue through the city of Lawrence to get the tax exemption on the bonds. Don't worry, Lawrence, you're not obligated on the bonds at all. They'll cover all the cost. That's what we mean by a conduit issuer. And I have, lastly, on this first slide, in terms of how these things are authorized, most of the time, it'll be the council adopting what we call a bond ordinance. Sometimes that ordinance will be kind of thick. Sometimes it'll be thin because it'll authorize a trust indenture. But at the end of the day, whether it's an ordinance or a trust indenture, that's the contract with the bondholders. That's what the bondholders look to for their rights and the obligations that you all have. And it'll have tax covenants and things like that in there. Most of the bonds that you all issue, some exceptions, will be tax exempt for federal income tax purposes. And that gives you a better interest rate. And I say most because there are certain obligations that you just can't issue as tax exempt because the rules won't allow it. On the next slide, this is kind of a short one. I covered this a little bit, but you all have water and sewer facilities, waterworks and sewage works. So when you have a capital project coming up or needs for your system, if you can't fund it with cash on hand, which is a lot of times the case, a lot of times these projects are expensive, you might go out and do a financing. And so you'll have waterworks revenue bonds, sewage works revenue bonds. You're not subject to your debt limit under case law. Utility revenues payable from a special fund don't count as debt, so we don't worry about that. They're payable exclusively from revenues of the particular utility. So sewer rate users are going to pay for the debt from the sewer utility. Water users are going to pay for water. We can't crisscross in Indiana, so you can't have your water ratepayers paying for your sewer. A good example would be, if I own a bunch of car washes in Lawrence, I ought not be having to pay a bunch more on sewer because I'm not causing that use, but I am on the water side. So this talks a little bit about that. Cover your operation and maintenance expenses first with a utility bond, and what's left over goes to the bondholders. Have a rate covenant. It'll be built into the ordinance, but this is required by statute anyway, that you always have to maintain your rates at a level sufficient to cover operation and maintenance expenses and the debt service on bonds. And so, you've always kind of got to be maintaining that, watching your customer base, seeing where your rates and charges are. As inflation happens, you see a lot of utilities doing rate adjustments now to kind of keep up with increasing insurance and energy costs. On this next slide here, we have kind of a little chart of boxes. I'm on page 4. And you can see how this works like on a utility bond. We've got our bondholders. They pay the utility. If we're doing a utility bond, let's say it's a $10 million sewer bond, they're going to pay you $10 million cash. You're going to give them $10 million in bonds. There's going to be a bond ordinance that authorizes that. And it's going to say those bondholders are paid from the net revenues. They have a first lien on the utility revenues as they come in. Can't issue additional debt without having sufficient coverage. They're going to comply with tax exemption. And if we go to the next page, it's similar for a general obligation bond. Same kind of structure. Bond ordinance, they give you cash, you get the bond, you take the cash, you go build your project, and these bonds, and most of these bonds we're talking about 20-year term. Okay, there's some exceptions, but on a new money deal, a lot of times you won't go out more than 20 years. 20 years is kind of the standard. It can be shorter, just depending on you're not borrowing as much, if you have more capacity, or whatever you're thinking about. And it can also go longer term if you're doing a monster project. You need that extra term, and the statute's allowed. You can go out 30 years in some cases. I do want to mention one thing on this slide on page 5. I've got a reference to an appropriation ordinance in here, and you all will see this on your agenda. You probably have. Anytime you do a bond issue that has as a payment source some type of a tax, so if it's a general obligation bond or a local income tax, you're going to see accompanying that bond ordinance what we call an appropriation ordinance. It's just like when you all do an appropriation. Bond ordinance says you can issue the bonds. The appropriation ordinance says you can spend those proceeds. Can't really spend them until you adopt that appropriation ordinance. And so you'll see that as a companion a lot of times on any financing that rolls through. You may see that an appropriation ordinance coupled with the bond ordinance. I'm on the slide on page 6 now. I just lost her a second. Any of you have any questions on what I'm saying? Okay, I'll keep going here. This is a building corporation structure. Okay, we mentioned this before. Debt limit. Why do we use a building corporation? Why do we have to do these leases? It's because of the debt limit. Okay, Lawrence, I believe you've done building corporation deals for your police station or fire station quite recently, I think. And you, as a council, probably approved a lease agreement as part of that. And that's the financing lease, and that's the vehicle to get the money to the bondholders. Lease payments match up almost identically with the debt service on the bonds. In fact, they don't even go to the building corporation. They go straight to the bond trustee. So you're getting an invoice from the trustee for your debt payment, your lease payment. You make it, goes to the trustee. Building bonds are in the name of the building corporation. They'll get the proceeds. You build your project. When the bonds are paid off, the assets entitled to the project revert back to the city. So that's how those are done. And we do these for debt limit purposes. Sometimes we'll put a mortgage on the building. A lot of school financings, they'll put a mortgage, like on a high school. You build a high school, they'll give the bondholders a mortgage on the building. But I'm seeing that less and less on the city side as years have gone by. When I started this about 25 years ago, we almost always did first mortgage bonds. Now we're kind of seeing them lease rental bonds. And I think the rationale is the bondholders don't really care to have a security interest in a city hall, for example. You can't do a whole lot with it. But they just want to know they're going to get paid, and they know that the lease rentals are going to provide that. I see here too, I have something covered by the state intercept. The state intercept is a statutory provision where the city of Lawrence has an obligation that they have to pay that's payable from a property tax levy. This could be a general obligation bond, or it could be a building corporation bond. And you get the invoice from the trustee. It says, all right, payment's due July 1. You need to have my payment here June 25. If they don't get that payment, then the trustee contact the treasurer of the state of Indiana and goes, we got a payment coming up here. I've not got the funds from the city. And the treasurer can go ahead and make that payment on behalf of Lawrence. And then what the state of Indiana will do is they will intercept monies that the state holds that would otherwise come to Lawrence. So typically local income tax revenues. But the whole point of this is to try to ensure to the bondholder community that there's kind of a backstop on these obligations. If the issuer doesn't make the timely payment, the state of Indiana will step in. I would say it's not as relevant in the context of cities and towns as it is with school corporations, because school corporations really only have one source of payment to pay bonds, and that is the tax levied funds. Cities and towns usually have multiple sources, so you don't see it happening as often, but when you hear the term state intercept, that's what we're talking about. Okay, I mentioned earlier economic development, TIF, and redevelopment commissions. Okay, Lawrence has a redevelopment commission, and this is the body that deals a lot with your developers. Ones that are coming in, they want to put a new project in. Maybe it's we see a lot of these now, mixed-use multifamily apartments coming in with first floor retail, and then 2 or 3 stories of apartments, and they may come in and they go, we have a fabulous project. It's going to bring a bunch of investment to Lawrence, but we have a gap. You'll see they say we have a gap. Maybe they need to do a parking garage, and this is where the redevelopment commission comes in. And if the city's inclined, you can create a TIF area on these projects, capture the assessed value from the new project. That creates a revenue stream that you can bond against, and you can put that money into the project. So a lot of times we'll see TIFs being used to put parking garages in on hotels or these multifamily projects. Or you may have, I think you have Monarch Beverage Facility here. That was done as a TIF years ago. That's an example where you have a developer come in with a large project, and it's similar to a tax abatement, but you're actually taking, helping to put into the project.
Madam Chair, I have a question related to this part. Two parts. Once we approve a bond, the contract and the information related to that bond, that public information is found where?
That's a great question, Councilman Giles. As bond counsel, we prepare a transcript, they call it. It used to look like a book, like this. We now put them on a flash drive in a PDF electronic format, and it contains all of the proceedings for the bond issue. The ordinances, the proofs of publication, the offering documents, the closing certificates, the bond purchase agreement, continuing disclosure agreement, everything related to the bonds is in that document. Now, we won't put in there, for example, construction contracts. So this is 100% related to the actual bond, getting the bond proceeds in.
Okay, so that's the portion that I'm concerned about that, I'm trying to learn. There have been bonds that we have approved and no work has been done. And on a developer bond. And so I'm concerned, at the time, I never thought about making sure that there was provisions or to ask about provisions of when the job is going to be done. And so what I don't like and what I'm concerned about, and I'm asking kind of with this, is there a way that when we come in here, get a bond for a developer, and we're always focused on the money, right, and all that, but we're never looking at the other language, are those types of requirements in the bond somewhere in that? Because I've never read the 600 pages or whatever. Is that in there? And can we hold somebody? If so, how do we hold somebody to that?
Okay, great question. Okay, now I'm going to tell you, in the context of like a general obligation bond, where you don't have a developer involved, and typically you're purchasing some equipment or doing some city hall, town hall things, not as much of a concern because, you're all in the same family. Different story when you're dealing with the developer with the TIF bond. The way we typically handle that, and I'll tell you, I do both sides of the role. Sometimes I represent developers and sometimes I do the TIF. But the best way I would tell you to handle that is you want to get an economic development agreement, or we call it a project agreement, sometimes executed upfront with that developer. That's going to say, you're going to invest this amount of money, you're going to create this amount of jobs, this is the kind of product you're going to build, so which can be very important. If you're doing a multifamily project, you don't want to issue the bonds and find out that they changed some of the materials.
Or they don't have the money to do the job.
They don't have the job.
Well, that's what I'm trying to protect because that is what I know is going on. And so what ends up happening is now, the other question is, can we move the bond to a developer that does have the money? Or are we tied in, married, waiting for this developer to get the money?
Yeah, that depends on what those documents say. And so,
And you said, where can I find those documents?
well, there's typically a transcript that's been done. And like when we do a deal, if we do a TIF bond, we'll put that economic development agreement in there. So you want to look at what those covenants say, what the agreements are with the developer. Now, I would tell you, when we work on these deals, we want to protect you. And so we'll put provisions in that say things, you need to complete the project by a certain date. When you you don't get all the bond proceeds up front. They sit under a trust indenture with a trustee. You submit a disbursement, and it's subject to city approval before it goes to the council. So we'll have a designated representative. Sometimes it's, the director of economic development or the controller. Anyone you designate signs off on claims before they go. What you don't want to have happen is you do a TIF bond and all the proceeds go to the developer and you don't have any teeth or any ability to pull that back, and maybe the project doesn't get completed or it does, and it's like, well, that's not what they told us it was going to be.
And so when you've been a council, you've been up here for almost 10 years, you start to think past just those dots here.
Yeah.
And so, and how do you hold people accountable to once you approve? And so that's where, since we have, you hear, that's where I'm trying to figure out, before I approve any more bonds, I know there's bonds sitting that we've approved and the work ain't been done yet.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to hold people accountable
Yep,
to us.
yeah.
And that's what, I'm sorry, so when you went to
No.
developer, that's what my mind is at. And then I feel like they have our land held hostage.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's a very fair point. And all I can tell you is you're all over it. And when you have a developer project come in, a new
I'm
project.
just little Terrell on 46th Street sitting at his kitchen
I know.
table thinking about this. So I'm trying to figure out.
And I think this, I'm going to look over here at Michael right now. And I've worked with Michael a bunch over the years, and you've got fantastic counsel.
Good.
And I think Michael would shake his head and kind of be in agreement that that's the kind of things that you want your counsel looking at. That's why you hire us. That's why you hire Michael, is to make sure that you're not in that situation.
Right. But I'm sitting here and the person I hired 8 years ago is not. So
Yeah,
I'm
I
trying
know.
to hold, you know what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but I want to be accountable to the people that elect us.
And I think what I could tell you there is, Councilman, if there's things that you want us, or, I'd encourage you to lean on Michael as well to take a look at on past financings that have closed. We can get access to those documents. We can kind of do an autopsy on them, if you will, and say, here's what was issued, here's what we know, here's what your rights are. Sometimes, it may be that there was an agreement that did have a bunch of covenants and things in there that it's like you said, you don't have it, so you don't know what rights you have,
And nobody's enforcing it.
and no one's enforced it, yeah.
I'm sorry to take that. another-
No, but it's a real fair point, and I'll tell you what, more and more, everyone's getting more sophisticated with these projects, and, these agreements, there's kind of a template for them, but we're seeing things added to them. Indianapolis, for example, has a pretty robust project agreement. They've really got it down.
Thank you. For that.
And so we kind of piggyback off that, and we have forms. So, if I would encourage you, if you have a big TIF project come in, you want to make sure you get that out early and start thinking about the things that you want to protect yourself on.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay, TIF, not subject to the debt limit. TIF is not actually, you're not levying a tax, you're just collecting what's being paid. And you can see I got a little chart here. Redevelopment Commission can issue directly payable from TIF. Has to be approved by the council, by the way. We can't do bonds without the council's approval. And it's for economic development, redevelopment projects. Redevelopment Commission has its own special taxing district, which is great. It's more horsepower for you. It's the same as the city's taxing district. So, they have separately, Redevelopment Commission has a $14 million debt limit capacity that they can use, and they can levy a tax to pay debt. And if they go over that debt limit, their building corporation is an entity called a redevelopment authority. Kind of serves the same purpose, but it's a statutorily created leasing body. I want to touch real quickly on economic development revenue bonds, and Councilman Giles, this was kind of your point. A lot of these economic development projects, TIFs, will issue what we call economic development revenue bonds, and that's because the developer, they want the proceeds to come to them so they can spend them on their project. A lot of times that's what you want to be the case. And when you're working with a good team, that's what you want. If the city does it, it's subject to public bidding. Okay, those works are subject to public bidding. And that means the developer may not have the ability to do the work. And that just doesn't work if you're putting in a garage in a mixed-use development that it's part of. So the statute for economic development revenue bonds exempts those projects from public bidding. You can provide the funds to the developer. Developer can be obligated to pay them back to the extent they're not payable from tax increment revenues. Sometimes we'll have what's called a taxpayer agreement, where the developer will sign it, and if they don't if the TIF is not sufficient, they got to pay the bonds. And if they don't pay the bonds, there's a property tax lien put on the development that can be foreclosed upon. It's a very powerful instrument. But you'll see these economic development bonds as kind of a term that's frequently being used. And your Monarch Beverage bonds, those were economic development revenue bonds. The next slide is, I won't go into the details here, but it's kind of a summary of how TIF works. We have a company project. We create the TIF area. The property taxes generated from that project captured by the Redevelopment Commission, that's the TIF. The underlying value continues to go out to the taxing units. So the best example of this is, you know, if you took the parking lot out there and let's say it was assessed at $100,000 right now, the property taxes from that $100,000, if it was privately owned, would be allocated to the library, the school, the city, the county. And if you built a $100 million building on there, the property taxes from the increase of the $100 million would get captured as TIF. It could then be used to go back and help that development or anything in serving or benefiting it. And that's kind of a crazy example. I mean, we're not going to have a $100 million building on that parking lot, but that's the concept. It's basically a net that captures those dollars. And it'll last for up to 25 years from when you do the first set of bonds. And I know the city's got a number of TIFs out there and has done some TIF bonds, but that's how it works. Almost always real property taxes, but you can have situations where you collect personal property taxes. If it's a manufacturing facility is usually the best example. But usually we're talking about real property tax dollars.
Another point with the TIF, I have a question for you. I want to make sure I have a correct understanding. If you have a TIF in a zone and it's been allocated a TIF, but there's been no development, the TIF is useless, right?
That's right.
We got a bunch of TIFs in Lawrence that there's no development of, they're useless.
Yeah. I call it a cornfield with a dream sometimes.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm
hear this.
on top of the stuff.
I hear sometimes everyone gets excited about TIFs, you know, and sometimes I've seen some areas of Indiana that have not had growth for a long time. They're rural areas, and there's a thought of, well, I want to make an industrial park, for example, and I have a cornfield out here. I'll just TIF it, and that'll magically make something happen. But it's not the case. You have to have development for the TIF to work. It's part of the machinery. It's like having a car with no gas in the tank. Mm-hmm. The money is the gas in the tank, and the motor for it is the TIF that will help drive it and drive those dollars back into the area. So you need to have both of them. And they work hand in hand, because a lot of times a developer is going to come in and say, I want to do a large project, I want an incentive, and I'm not going to do it without the incentive. And you're like, okay, we'll give you 80% of the TIF, and whatever, that can be negotiated. And the developer's like, then we sign that agreement, they do their project, the TIF starts cranking, that helps pay for a portion of it. But to your point, Councilman, if I have a TIF area and nothing is being built on it, then it's not generating anything. And, you know, you might say, well, then, I mean, the TIF's not causing a property tax increase to anyone. It's just sort of laying there dormant. What we'll do a lot of times now, because TIFs have 25-year lives, is we'll come in and you may be 15 years into it, and you have someone come along and they're like, I want to do a project in your TIF, but it's only got 10 years left on it, or 15 years left on it. Mm-hmm. We'll pull that parcel out, and we'll create a new TIF for it.
Just for,
Did that?
right, we did that with the Meyer.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you can even do what's called kind of pruning your TIF areas. I'm working with
I like that.
a rather large community here on the west side of the state, where we're going in and we're auditing all of their TIFs. And what we're doing is we're finding out what parcels are not creating increment. And not only are they not creating increment, they're creating decrement, meaning since the TIF area was created, they've gone down in assessed values. And so it's like you're driving a boat and you're dragging a bunch of ropes behind it that's slowing it down. That's kind of what these decrement parcels are, and we're going to cut them off. We're going to pull them out and prune that area. And that's going to help, the other areas aren't going to get dragged down. That's going to help with the TIF. So it's kind of a housekeeping thing. When you have these TIF areas, you want to keep an eye on them, and, that's kind of why you've got your advisors and consultants to help you out. I got a good I'll shut up. I'll just tell you this example real quick. I did a TIF a while ago, about 10 years ago. Had a large kind of for-profit hospital within the TIF. It turned a nonprofit, and it created a huge vacuum in the TIF area. And so we went in and we pulled it out.
They weren't paying anything in anymore.
Yeah, once they became nonprofit, and it just became a drag on the increment. So, but yeah, I mean, you're right. TIF is only as good as if you have some action going on.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, what can TIF be used for? In serving or benefiting is the terminology. So the project doesn't have to be in the TIF area, but it's got to be benefiting it. We're usually talking utility improvements, roads, sidewalks, drainage, land acquisition, development, buildings, equipment. Not be used for operating expenses. That's a big no-no. So we can't be paying salaries, can't be paying utility bills, ongoing maintenance. We can't really be doing that. So, you could have a TIF area on the east side of the city, and you could fund improvements to your sewer plant as long as that sewer plant's helping to serve that TIF area. So that's kind of where the benefiting comes in too. There's got to be some nexus between that.
So infrastructure that is not in the TIF, but it supports the TIF.
Yes. And that's kind of a legislative determination that you all have to make when you're looking at those kinds of expenditures. You've got to be able to make that connection. It'd be kind of hard to say, for example, that if you had a TIF area on the west side of town creating a bunch of money and you did some sidewalks on the east side of town. That might be kind of a hard one to do, but.
You got to walk to the west side.
Now you're starting to sound like an attorney. Okay. This is another set of slides. I'm on page 12 here. This is sort of, if you followed all these boxes here, this is what it looks like with an economic development bond with a TIF pledge. Okay, this is like your Monarch deal.
So you've mentioned Monarch a couple of times. And I'm just wondering, are you pruning for that loss? I mean, that's huge.
Oh, I'm only using, I know nothing about Monarch other than that it was an economic development bond. And I
Yeah.
only know that from the context of quite a while ago, like, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, we were doing bonds for you all. And the Monarch debt was out there, and it was at a time when the interest rates were really favorable. And so we were looking at maybe doing a refunding of that deal. So I happened to see the transcript and know it was an economic development bond, but
You didn't do that one.
no, not originally.
And you're not doing the TIF down on Shadeland in English for them.
No. So if there's a current history with Monarch, and it sounds like there might be, I'm not aware of those.
Well, you know what this kind of gets at, not to take, but the next lead to this is when you get the TIFs, I believe the Monarch TIF is moonlighted, right? I believe. So what I've read is that these corporations will come into a community, we TIF it, and then when it's over,
They
they go on
leave.
down the road for the next place to TIF it. And then, so I don't know, this, maybe it's a conversation for another day, but we're curious to know, what do we do now? Like, we're at that place now to learn, okay, how do we make that work? Do we have to now have this large parcel and TIF it for somebody else to come in? Or, and that's what she meant by the carve out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good conversation to have. It's the same thing with tax abatements. You give a company a tax abatement for 10 years, what you don't want to have happen is the 10 years runs up and they're like, I'm out of here. I'm going over to the next community and I'm going to move my headquarters over there.
And another piece of this for us up here, when they got the TIF, The guy owned it, he lived in Lawrence, so the council at that time thought he'd never leave. But he sells his business, and so that's why I'm not so skeptical sometimes when people, just because they live in Lawrence, don't mean that,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, that's kind of one of those philosophical semantic discussions we always have with incentives is, what you really want to have happen is you have like a Caterpillar or Subaru, something comes in and they make a big investment in the community. You gave, Lilly, you gave them great incentives, they're here, and what you want to have happen is the next time they're doing expansion, they don't leave.
Right,
They come to you and
grow.
they go, we've invested, $100 million. We want to invest another $100 million. We want to stay here and commit to the community. There's only so much you all can do. You can't force a business to stay, but you want to hope that they like where they're at and are partners and will keep investing. Yeah.
Because most of us in this room remembers when that was a drive-in, and we were thought, and here we are now. I mean, so 20 years go by real fast.
Yeah. No, I hear exactly. The one thing you hate to see is, nearby communities competing for each other's businesses. That's not the big school of things. Are we helping each other that way? I don't know. I guess you're getting help if it's coming to you. Yeah. Okay. I got a list here. This is kind of the transaction professionals. I'm on page 13. Bond counsel, this is the person, this is kind of the stuff I typically do. Put together all the bond documents, quarterback the transaction. The way this works a lot of times is you may have, for example, let's say you need to build a new fire station. And you need it. You have to have it. It's like, well, where do you start? You're going to get an architect to do some designs for you. They're going to come up with some cost estimates, and then what do? Like, we've got to pay for this thing. You're going to get your municipal advisor engaged, a bondery. You're going to get your bond counsel engaged to say, okay, here's the steps you need to go through to get this accomplished. You're going to have your city's attorney, Michael. It's going to oversee the documentation and oversee the approval process. Make sure there's no litigation, handle with a lot of real estate issues, things like that. The purchasers of the bonds are going to have their own counsel. You're going to have an underwriter, and that's the company that goes out and actually sells the bonds. Okay, you're talking Stifel, Nicholas, Baird, KeyBank, First Merchants, First Internet. There's a whole host of institutions out there that do that kind of thing. But this is the team you're generally going to see, and you'll see a distribution list a lot of times that will have all these people, all their emails on it, and they're part of this working group to get this thing done. I've got some just other considerations here on page 14. We don't need to go through them, but you might hear sometimes someone say, well, let's do a bond anticipation note, let's do a ban. What that is, that's a short-term borrowing that you do in anticipation of issuing bonds. And why would you do that? You say, why wouldn't I just issue bonds? Well, let's say that you were doing a $20 million sewer project, had engineering fees you needed to pay now, and those engineering fees are $1 million, and you don't have $1 million. You're not ready to borrow $20 million because you got to get through engineering before you can borrow the money. You can go out and you can do a bond anticipation note for $1 or $2 million. It can be up to 5 years long. Payable from the bond proceeds when they're issued. We do them all the time, and typically it's to cover preliminary expenses. And they could also be used to, like if you want to do a borrowing ahead of some growth you're expecting. Tax abatements, we saw this one, was just talking about that. I'm sure you all are familiar with those. You'll hear continuing disclosure referred to sometimes. When you issue bonds, you have an annual requirement to provide updated financial information. And if they're publicly underwritten, there's a portal called EMMA that's run by the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board where you post this information each year. Now, your Bondry, someone like Bondry can help you do this. You get an audit, you post it. You get certain operating data, you post it. But you need to keep that up to date. And the whole purpose of that is a bond floats around, okay? It's not like a bank loan that stays with the bank. I can buy a bond one day, and then I can go out and sell it 2 weeks ago to another investor, and it's moving all around. And those investors, as they buy it, let's say the bond matures in 20 years, and you're 10 years into it, and I want to sell it to another investor. That investor can go on to the MSRB website and look up that obligation on Lawrence and see the updated continuing disclosure information you all have posted to know financially, are you still in a good spot? Has anything changed? It's just a way to keep that, your financial information up to date so bondholders know what's coping. Tax status of bonds, we mainly do them tax exempt. Sometimes we'll do them taxable. Draw bonds, that's when we do a bond like a line of credit. We can do that, but we have to have a bank buy it, okay? But your smaller bond issues, sometimes we can do that. Have on here Fort Harrison Reuse Authority. You all are unique in that you have a reuse authority with the old base here. There's only a few of them in the state of Indiana, but it's basically its own TIF area is what that is. And projects can be done out there to help, take the old base and then rehab it and put new projects in there. And you as a council have authority to approve those bond issues and oversee that along with the authority. So there's the authority board, but if they want to do a borrowing, come to council. And then parks, you'll hear energy savings contracts sometimes referred to, equipment leases, installment financings.
Another question with reuse. Can the other TIFs pay the city like the reuse TIF does?
The other TIFs, if the city pays for improvements in a TIF area, the TIF area where those improvements are made can reimburse the city for those. Okay.
We'll get some reimbursement from.
Yeah, and we do that quite a bit. Sometimes we need to get, it's a way of kind of cycling dollars, but, if you've been spending a bunch of lit dollars, let's say, for example, doing sidewalk and road improvements in a TIF area, and that TIF area's got a bunch of cash, and it wasn't being used for that, that money, that TIF money could be paid back to the city for those expenditures and help reimburse, fill your lit funds back up. Yeah. These last two slides, and I kind of stole from Marielle on here. She was kind enough, Oscar and his team and Marielle, to put these together. This is just a schedule of what we believe to be your outstanding bond debt. Now, this comes off of Gateway, and I think that, Marielle, am I right? You guys are kind of double checking that and just seeing that it's accurate. Yeah. Yeah, so, it's the kind of thing, it's as good as what's put in there. Now, we believe this to be quite accurate, but you've got your list of debt obligations here. You can see a lot of them are sewer bonds, water bonds, and redevelopment district bonds. You don't have any GO bonds outstanding at the moment. And then this last page are your outstanding capital leases. A lot of times you do leases, they're subject to appropriation, meaning that that's coming out of your general fund budget. And you're going to appropriate, it's coming out of your general fund budget. As opposed to when you do a bond issue, it does not come out of your general fund. You've got a separate levy when you do a bond issue. And that's kind of a good budget. It's a good budgeting tool to think about of maybe taking some items that you've always funded from your general fund and putting them into a bond issue because you get a separate levy. That frees up money in your general fund that you can do other things with. And I'll tell you, I do some school financings as well, and this has really been taking off with schools in the last 10 years or so, particularly with what's been happening with circuit breaker and things like that. Taking some things they've normally just funded from their operating fund and doing a small bond issue, it gives them a levy to pay for it, and then that frees up money, in their other funds. But you'll see here, you all have a number of leases that are like that. And that's it. I've got our contact information here. Like I said, this will go on, and we could talk for hours, but I hope it helps. Feel free to contact me or call me if you have any questions, or Jacob as well. We want to be a resource for you.
So are the lease rental revenue bonds, I'm assuming those are the police station and fire station
Yep.
because of the dollar amount?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I did have something. I had a couple more handouts here.
Okay.
Then I'll stop talking. All right, this one, this is Marielle's schedule from Bondre here.
It was provided on a PowerPoint at some point, and I agree it was helpful, so there's a handout that you can take and that.
Yeah, and this has your tax rates on it, and you can see how your net assessed value's been growing, and it has some comparable cities, so you can see where you all rank with the TIF. And then the last schedule here, and I know this is going to be discussed further, I think it's your Finance Committee meeting on Wednesday, is the timetable that we have for the bonds and the CCD funds. And we've put in red. You said, why is there red? Well, the red is the CCD fund stuff, because they have their own sets of procedures.
Yeah. We need another one. It's been time for a new one.
All right.
Okay.
Anything else?
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. No, thank you all. It's great to be here. Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Alton. Do council members have any questions, or are there any further discussions?
Is there someone from Baird talking to us tonight? Or, because isn't that the managing underwriter?
I don't know that they were asked to present tonight, but if you had specific questions, maybe myself or Marielle could try to address those, or at least get those over to the team at Baird and get you information back on your question.
I didn't have anything specific. I just wanted to. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next agenda item under new business is proposal number 3, 2024. Madam Clerk, would you please read the title of the proposal into the record?
Proposal number 3, 2024, an ordinance of the City of Lawrence, Indiana, authorizing the issuance of general obligation bonds for the purpose of providing funds to pay the cost of local municipal improvement projects within the city and effect the current refunding of various equipment lease financing obligations of the city, providing for the payment of such bonds from ad valorem taxes to be levied upon all the taxable property located in the city to the extent not paid from general revenues of the city legally available for such purpose, providing for the safeguarding of the interests of the owners of said bonds, other matters connected therewith, and repealing ordinance inconsistent herewith.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. On behalf of the Common Council, I am referring proposal number 3, 2024, to the Administration Budget and Finance Committee for consideration and recommendations. The next item under new business is proposal number 4, 2024. Madam Clerk, would you please read the title of the proposal into the record?
Proposal number 4, 2024, appropriation ordinance, City of Lawrence, Indiana, general obligation refunding and improvement bonds.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. On behalf of the Common Council, I am referring proposal number 4, 2024, to the Administration, Budget, and Finance Committee for consideration and recommendations. The next agenda item, comments of the administration. Do we have any comments this evening?
Thank you, Council. Just a few comments from administration. So I hope you all received the email from me earlier this week about inviting you all to the State of the City tomorrow at Lawrence Central High School. It will be tomorrow at 5:30 at the Lawrence Central Auditorium. Make sure you enter door 11. It's at 5:30, so we hope you all will be there. There will be reserved seating for counselors and the clerk as well. The mayor has asked the council participate in the ceremony, particularly the Pledge of Allegiance. So I hope everyone can be there. We'll let you know with some more information as they arise, but otherwise we'll see you tomorrow. This will be a great opportunity for the city to hear the first 100 days of Mayor Whitfield's administration, but also to some announcements of some new initiatives that's happening here in the city. Also, too, I want to thank everyone, who came out to the total eclipse last week. We had a great turnout of nearly 2,500 families that came out to the Lawrence Community Park. I want to give a special thank to Councilman Jennings, who was the DJ for the total eclipse, and it was a one-in-a-lifetime experience that the city of Lawrence was able to participate in. We're in the line of totality, and I just want to thank all of the Lawrence Police, Lawrence Fire, and all of those who participate and make sure everyone got home safely in the community. And with that, if council, do you have any other questions for me, I'd be happy to address them after the council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a comment? Okay. Thank you, Deputy Chief Lovell. Next will be the citizens' comments. And I have Mr. Daniel Rapp. Please speak into the mic and state your name and address for the record. Thank you.
Daniel Rapp, 5718 Waldingwood Drive in Lawrence. I have 3 points to make. The first two deal with transparency. On proposal number 3, I heard a lot of talk here about the front end, the bond. I'm concerned with the back end, since I'm a property owner. How much property tax increase are we talking about? Something less than 1% of assessed valuation? Or are we talking about 5 to 20%? You need to be transparent and let the public know how much taxes are going to increase because of these bonds. That's point 1. When I went and looked at proposal number 4, it appeared to also to be a tax increase on the citizens of the city of Lawrence. Unless I'm missing something here, we're talking about tax increases. And that is an item of public interest because not everyone can pass on additional costs. Those are my 2 points on transparency, and I would like to see on proposal 3 and 4 something put out there about how much the tax increase will be projected. Third point, there was a comment made at the very beginning of this about open meeting policy protocol, that it was met. I disagree with that statement being made. At 6 o'clock tonight, before I came over here, I went out to the City of Lawrence webpage and I looked on the calendar of events. This meeting at 6:30 tonight was not on the calendar. So the public did not know that this meeting was taking place. So I don't think your open policy meeting protocol was met. And you can check it on and I assume that the public gets notified based on the City of Lawrence webpage. And it was not on the calendar. One reason I saw it was I saw the agenda marked because I was looking for another agenda. I thank you for your time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Charles Knapp.
evening.
Good evening. I'm Charles Knapp, 5728 Wallingwood Drive, Lawrence, Indiana. My wife and I have lived in the community since '85, but actually on Wallingwood for the last quarter century. My comments kind of go along with Dan's. The ad valorem taxes, it's according to value. And, I know Dan's retired. My wife and I are both retired. Money is tight. We just got our state property tax statements. They went up. And so what concerns me is that we're talking again about covering a shortfall of the spending of the city of Lawrence on the backs of the taxpayers, the property owners of Lawrence. And I don't know that that's right without us knowing what that is. I don't know if anybody has any idea of what the shortfall of the general revenues might be. And then dividing that out by the property taxes, or property owners or properties that are going to be taxed, that will be taxed. Again, is that, $1,000 a property or is it $10,000 a property? So knowing about the amount of the shortfall, and then will that amount vary by year to year? Because your spending of the city of Lawrence is not going to be the same year to year. The general revenues aren't going to be the same from year to year. If you guys set a tax increase on us, is it going to vary year to year because expenses and revenues are going to vary? I don't think so. Normally, when those taxes are set, they stay or they go up. So, I mean, just knowing, there's too many unknowns in here, and all this information about bonds and stuff, that's great, but that's kind of normal person put to sleep type stuff. So, year to year, and then can exemptions be made? Is it possible for the Lawrence City Council to carve out exemptions for people that are elderly? I don't consider my wife and I elderly, but she tells me we are because we're over 65. Can exemptions be made for people that are elderly and that are on their primary property, a primary residence? Because this is one of the things I'm going to the state with, trying to get some sort of set aside for elderly that are their primary property, their residences are exempt or they have a lower property tax. We've never had kids in the Lawrence public school system. We've been paying property taxes for schools since '85. So it's not a problem, but as we're retired now, it's like, are we still, why do we still have to do that for the state, for the city, for all this? So I kind of want to know if it's possible to get an exemption on the primary residences of the people that are considered elderly. And so what concerns me again is bonds, 20-year duration. Hopefully I'll be around in 20 years, but I don't want this to be a burden on our backs. And at some point, y'all are a fairly young city council, considering what the age population is in Indiana, at some point you guys will all be considered elderly. So it would behoove people, I think, all of us to have that kind of a set aside or something, exemption put in, any kind of tax that the city of Lawrence is going to put on us, older people that are on very fixed incomes at this point. So I appreciate you hearing me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The next agenda item is adjournment. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Councilor Zach. Do we have a second?
Second.
Who second? Okay, thank you, Councilor Wells. Any discussion? We will now proceed to vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. It's unanimous. Adjourned.